The Indiana sky hung heavy that afternoon, one of those damp, gray blankets that refuses to snow, just presses down on everything until the whole street feels quieter than it should. Christmas lights trembled along the roofs, their red and green glow smearing across the wet pavement like color trying to stay alive. Behind me, my old truck cooled with a series of soft metallic ticks, the kind you hear only when the day has already taken its warmth back. I stood there a moment, the cookie tin warm against my palm, looking across the lawn at the house where my son built his perfect little life. His windows glowed a soft golden yellow, holiday movie, warm postcard, clean, polished in a way real families rarely are. Inside, shadows shifted, a tripod being adjusted, a blanket smoothed for the background of whatever seasonal moment they were staging. The ring light hummed faintly, its artificial halo cutting through the curtains like a second moon. Holden's silhouette crossed the hall twice. Shoulders tight, head down, the glow of his phone lighting half his face. He didn't look up, not once. And something in that stillness, something in the way he held himself, told me whatever distance had been growing between us wasn't just in my imagination. A cold gust climbed up my collar, lifting the scent of nutmeg from the tin. My fingers tightened around the lid, not from the weather, but from a feeling I couldn't shake anymore, something that had been building in the quiet spaces between our conversations. I stepped onto the first board of the porch, hearing the wood creak, a long, low sound almost like a warning. And as I reached the top step, the wind caught the lid of the cookie tin as I stepped onto Holden's porch, nudging the smell of sugar and nutmeg back toward me. Christmas lights blinked along the gutter in steady pulses, a little too bright against the gray afternoon. I paused with my hand lifted, feeling a stiffness run through my fingers the way it does on cold mornings when the joints remember things I try to forget. Before I knocked, the door opened. Maribel stood there with her phone tilted just so her smile stretched wide for a world that lived behind the screen. She looked at the tin in my hands and said in a soft, airy tone that adults don't really need Christmas gifts. Her voice floated out like a line from one of her holiday styling videos, rehearsed and polished. Holden stood behind her. He had that familiar look of watching two things at once, his phone and me. His eyes flicked over my shoulder as if checking that the scene stayed clean for whatever she was filming. He said something under his breath, just enough for me to know my timing was wrong again. I stepped back. Their reflections moved in the window, bright shapes adjusting lights and smoothing the moment I had interrupted. I handed her the tin because my hands needed to let something go. She took it like it was a decoration she hadn't planned for. The gravel under my boots cracked lightly as I walked back to my truck. The kind of sound winter makes when it wants you to notice how alone you are. I climbed inside and closed the door. Warm air from the heater drifted across my face. For a moment I stared at their porch light glowing in the mirror, a steady circle that felt like it belonged to someone else's holiday. Driving through the quiet neighborhoods, I passed one house after another lined with blinking lights and inflatable snowmen that leaned slightly in the wind. The kind of decorations that tried their best to look cheerful even when the sky couldn't make up its mind. The radio hummed an old carol. I turned it down until it was little more than a memory. A notification blinked on the dashboard. New trusted contact request on your account. My hand tightened on the wheel. At the next red light, the glow of the message reflected on the windshield in a way that made the cold feel sharper. By the time I got home, the house felt colder than it should. I set my keys on the kitchen counter, opened the laptop, and let the blue light fill the dim room. The bank agent explained the request came from an email with my name. An email created recently. An email created by me according to the system. The furnace clicked on. Warm air pushed through the vents, steady and indifferent. I rubbed my thumb across the wooden edge of the table, feeling the familiar groove where years of elbows and plates had rested. I thought of last Thanksgiving. Holden had insisted on helping me modernize my finances. He filled out forms while I basted the turkey. He told me not to worry. I nodded even though I didn't understand half of what he was doing. Now the cursor blinked like a warning light in the corner of the screen. In the living room, the old armchair sat beneath the window, the one where Alara used to fold laundry. The faint scent of her lavender detergent still clung to the fabric when the heater ran. I didn't walk over to touch it. I only looked at it from across the room the way a man looks at something he isn't sure he's ready to feel again. I turned off the kitchen light. The room settled into low shadows and the hum of the refrigerator filled the silence. My hand rested on the back of a chair. I could feel the cold rising through the wood. Somewhere deep inside something shifted, quiet, small. A feeling that didn't need words. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, each second placing itself into the stillness like a reminder that time kept moving even when a man wasn't sure where he stood. I stayed there for a long moment, breathing in the faint scent of winter air that had followed me inside. The house held its silence, the kind that tells you more than you want to hear. It felt like the start of a crack running through metal that had held for years, and I knew it was only the beginning. The blue light from the laptop spread across the kitchen table like a thin sheet of cold water. It was the only thing bright in the room. The refrigerator hummed behind me, steady and familiar, as if nothing in my life had shifted since I closed my eyes earlier that evening. I pulled out the chair, slowly letting the legs scrape across the floor. The sound felt louder than it should have in a house this quiet. I logged into my banking again. The page opened with its usual list of balances and numbers all sitting there politely as if waiting for my approval. I clicked the activity log. 11 entries lined up in a neat column, each one stamped between 2 and 4 in the morning. Those were the hours when I usually came home from work, ate whatever leftovers were in the fridge, and fell asleep in the recliner before the late news finished. I hovered the mouse over each entry, watching the timestamps flash like little warning beacons. A gust of wind pressed against the window. The glass let out a faint rattle, and the Christmas lights from across the street flickered through the blinds in narrow stripes of red and green. Every IP address on the log came from Holden's neighborhood. I knew the first few digits before the information finished loading. My stomach tightened the way it used to when a well didn't cool right, and I knew I would have to cut it loose and start again. 7 transfers sat beneath the log entries. Small amounts in the grand scheme of life, but larger than anything I spent on myself during the holidays. Holiday support for Dad. The words felt strange, too polished to have come from me. I clicked one of the transactions and watched the balance adjust without hesitation, as if the money had never belonged to me at all. The phone buzzed on the table. I hesitated before answering. A calm voice introduced himself as Cyrus from the bank's fraud department. He spoke gently with the patience that told me he had walked older men through similar calls. He asked if I recognized the late-night sessions. I told him no. He asked if I wanted the account frozen for safety. The words came out of my mouth before I could think about them. Not yet. He didn't push. He simply said he would note the file and wished me a peaceful holiday. It was the kind of kindness that feels like a bruise. When the call ended, I stared at the dark window. My reflection hovered there, a little distorted, the lines on my face more visible under the laptop glow. I remembered a night months ago when I heard a sound near the hallway. A soft creak, the kind a house makes when temperatures drop suddenly. I blamed the pipes. The memory came back now with a weight I didn't like. I opened the drawer in the hallway where I kept an old backup camera. It was a small square device with a scratched lens. Something I had installed years back when there had been a string of break-ins on our block. I plugged it in. The light flickered, hesitated, then stayed on. I clicked through the files. Most were empty hallways and quiet nights. One video loaded without sound, 3:14 in the morning. A night Holden had stopped by to help with my phone. The footage showed a shadow moving toward the office. The shape was careful, deliberate. I leaned closer, breath holding itself in my chest. The chair inside the office gave a soft creak as the figure sat down. The glow from the monitor lit his face just enough for me to see my own son in the half-light. My hand tightened on the edge of the desk. For a moment I forgot to breathe. I paused the frame. His shoulders, the way he leaned forward, it was unmistakable. I stepped back, letting a cold wave wash through me. The heater clicked off again, leaving the room wrapped in a silence that felt heavier than the dark. A memory flashed, brief and cutting. Holden as a boy, sitting in that same office chair, spinning it around until he was dizzy, laughing with his whole body. The contrast pressed against my ribs. I lowered myself into the chair nearest me, the cushion sighing under my weight. Outside, a car rolled down the street, tires crunching over frozen patches. The headlights swept across the wall and disappeared. I could feel the cold creeping in through the gap below the window frame. I rubbed my palms together out of habit, though it did little to help. I looked down at my hands. They were steady but heavy, like they were holding more than their own weight. These were hands that had welded steel for decades, hands that had held my children, hands that had taken care of everything in this house. Now they just rested there, unsure of what to do next. The armchair by the window caught my eye, the one Alara had made her own. I walked toward it slowly and placed a hand on the backrest. The fabric held a bit of warmth from the heater that had run earlier, but it cooled quickly under my touch. I stood there looking at the faint outline of the cushion where she used to sit. For a moment I could almost hear her humming low under her breath, a habit she had when she was thinking. The clock in the hallway ticked one steady beat after another. I sat down on the edge of the armchair. The wind brushed against the outside of the house again, softer this time, almost uncertain. I closed my eyes and let the dark settle. The banking logs, the video, the silhouette of my son in a room he had no reason to be in, they lined up inside me like pieces waiting to be acknowledged. I opened my eyes slowly, looking around the room as if it might answer the questions rising in my chest. Something had shifted. It was quiet but firm, a line drawn somewhere I hadn't noticed before. I stayed there, breathing in the faint scent of cinnamon left from the cookies I baked earlier. The scent drifting through the house like a reminder of a holiday that didn't feel like mine anymore. A soft vibration from my phone lit up the corner of the room, a small glow cutting through the dim. I didn't reach for it. I simply watched the light fade, knowing it was the start of something I could no longer ignore. The phone's screen lit the corner of the room in a faint glow, but I didn't reach for it right away. I was still sitting in the armchair where I had ended the last hour, letting the house breathe around me, letting the truth move into the empty spaces without asking permission. The heater clicked on again, warm air pushing through the vents, and the lights from the street cast thin shadows across the carpet. I lifted myself from the chair and walked back to the kitchen table. The wood felt colder now, as if it had been left outside. I sat down and let my hands rest on the edge, steadying myself. The cursor blinked on the laptop, still waiting after all this time. My mind drifted back to last year's Thanksgiving, to the smell of turkey and rosemary, to Holden standing at the counter, tapping his fingers as he talked about efficiency and keeping up with technology. He had taken my phone from my hands with the confidence of someone who believed he knew what was best. Guiding my finger across the screen, he had said it was simple, that I needed to stay ahead of things. The way he spoke made me feel both taken care of and belittled at the same time, like a father and a child living inside the same body. He suggested mobile banking, said it would save me time. Said I would not have to drive across town anymore when I needed to sign a form or check something important. I remember the way he sighed, annoyed but pretending not to be whenever I hesitated. And I went along with it because it was Thanksgiving, because the house smelled warm, because I was tired of being the man who still paid bills at the post office. A few days later, he told me we needed to notarize some simple safety paperwork. I thought it meant something with the house deed or a form for emergencies. He drove us to the UPS store, the kind with the smell of cardboard and printer ink. He held the clipboard while I signed. Convenience account, he said. Durable power of attorney, he added, just in case. His voice had sounded so casual that I didn't let myself dwell on the words. I signed where he pointed, trusting the boy I had raised to tell me the truth. My hand trembled a little as I reached for the phone now. I dialed Tamsin. The line connected, and for a few seconds neither of us spoke. I could hear her breathing steady but cautious, the way she always breathed when something serious lived between us. "Dad," she said, "what happened?" I swallowed. The words scraped their way out. I told her everything. The late-night logins, the IP addresses, the transfers I never saw, the footage of Holden in my office, every suspicion I had swallowed for the sake of peace. The silence on her end tightened around me like a rope. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft but firm. "Dad, I need to see you right now. There is more you have not heard." I nodded, even though she could not see me. Then the line went quiet except for a faint exhale before she hung up. I waited at the kitchen table. The fridge hummed quietly, the sound somehow heavier than usual. My chest felt tight, not from fear, but from the slow realization that this truth had been circling me for months, maybe longer. I rubbed my palms together, listening to the soft scrape of skin, trying to calm the rising pulse in my throat. Outside, the wind brushed snow against the window. The lights from the neighbor's house blinked in uneven patterns as if they were struggling to stay lit. I stared at them until headlights swept across my window, pulling me back into the room. Relief and dread rose together in my chest, two forces pushing against each other. A car door closed softly. Footsteps approached. The knock was gentle, cautious. I stood and opened the door. Tamsin stepped inside, brushing a strand of hair from her face as the cold followed her into the house. She looked at me for a long moment, her eyes searching mine, not surprised by the fear she found there. "Only sorry, Dad," she said. "You should sit down." Her voice trembled just enough for me to know this wasn't going to be a simple conversation. She placed her hand on my arm and guided me back to the kitchen. The house felt different with her in it, as if it had been waiting for someone who understood its quiet. She glanced at the laptop screen still glowing on the table, then back at me. "I have heard things," she said, "things I did not want to believe." She pulled out a chair and sat across from me, her fingers laced together, knuckles pale. She didn't speak right away. She let the silence stretch the way people do when they are deciding how much truth a person can take at once. "There were nights," she said slowly, "when Holden talked to Maribel about handling your finances. He said it was easier if he controlled everything. Said you were slipping." Her voice tightened at the edges. I thought he was exaggerating. I did not want to think he meant anything worse. She looked at the doorway as if expecting someone else to walk in, someone who could take the burden from her. "And Dad," she added quietly, "there is something else. Something the kids heard. It is not just about money." My breath caught. The heater clicked off, leaving the house in a stillness that felt heavy and expectant. Before she could continue, a faint rustle came from the hallway. Rowan peered around the corner, his small face pale in the dim light. I had not even noticed that she had brought the children. Uma slipped in behind him, holding on to the sleeve of her coat with both hands. They looked at me with eyes too old for their ages. Grandpa Rowan whispered, "We need to tell you something." The room held its breath with me. Tamsin reached for my hand across the table. Her grip was firm, steady, the way Alara used to steady me when bad news hovered just out of reach. "Dad," she said again, "this is going to be hard." The refrigerator hummed. Snow tapped softly against the window. The children stood there in the doorway waiting, and I knew another part of the truth was about to step into the light. The house was still holding its breath from the moment Rowan stepped forward in the hallway. I could feel it in the way the walls seemed to listen, in the way the heater paused between cycles as if waiting for something to be said. Tamsin guided the kids farther inside, closing the door gently behind them. The air that followed them in was sharp and dry, carrying a hint of snow that clung to their coats. Rowan held a backpack against his chest. Uma hovered near his arm, her eyes moving slowly across the room, taking in the silence. The dim kitchen light, the tension they were too young to name but old enough to recognize. I motioned toward the table. They sat carefully, as though lowering themselves into a place where truth could spill without warning. Tamsin rubbed her hands together and looked at me with a steadiness that came from weeks, maybe months, of trying to protect pieces of something she had not known how to bring forward. She took a breath that shivered at the edges. "Dad," she said, "I need to tell you what I heard last summer." Her voice wasn't dramatic. It didn't rise or tremble. It simply carried weight. She leaned forward a little. I saw the reflection of the overhead light flicker in her eyes. "There were evenings at Holden's house," she said, "when the kids were in the backyard and I walked inside to grab something. More than once I overheard them talking. Holden and Maribel." She didn't continue right away. She watched my face, measuring how much I could hold. They were saying things like, when Dad starts slipping, the guardianship should go smoothly. They talked about paperwork, about timing, about needing a pattern that looked convincing. The heater clicked on behind us. The warm air pushed across the floor, but it did nothing for the cold that moved through my chest. Slipping. The word landed with the quiet weight of a hammer. Tamsin's fingers tightened together. She looked down as though she didn't want to say the next part, but she forced herself. "And Dad," she said, "the anonymous APS calls, the ones about you forgetting medication and leaving the stove on, those were hers, Maribel's." My breath stumbled, catching halfway in my throat. The reports had been false. I knew they had been false, but I also knew what those kinds of claims could justify if someone pushed them far enough. Guardianship, control, decisions made in my name without my voice attached to them. I looked at the kids, both sitting too still, their faces pale in the kitchen light. They had heard pieces of this before tonight, enough to sense danger even if they didn't understand the system behind it. Rowan cleared his throat softly, the way a child does when he's trying to be brave for someone older. He tightened his grip on the backpack as if what was inside might break if he loosened his arms even slightly. "Grandpa," he said quietly, "we found something." Tamsin lowered her gaze and nodded, confirming without words that this was the moment she had dreaded. She reached over and rested her hand on Rowan's back. His shoulders eased just a little, but he didn't let go of the bag. I motioned for him to come closer. He stood from the chair and walked around the table, his small footsteps soft against the floor. Uma followed, staying close enough to touch the sleeve of his coat. They stopped beside me. Rowan looked up at me, his expression older than it should have been, as if he had carried this truth too long. He unzipped the backpack partway, not enough for me to see inside, just enough to show he was ready. He looked at his mother first. She nodded again. "I saw something I didn't understand," he whispered. "But I knew it wasn't right, so I saved it." The snow outside tapped against the window, a slow and steady rhythm that made the silence inside feel even heavier. I felt a pressure behind my ribs, not anger, not panic, but a realization curling inward. My own son had been building something behind me. A story about incompetence, a pattern of decline, a foundation of lies ready to collapse on top of me. When he decided the time was right, the kitchen lights flickered once, just a faint dip in brightness that made all of us glance upward. When they steadied again, the room felt different. The truth had moved closer. It was no longer lurking in corners. It was sitting at the table with us. Tamsin reached across and placed her hand over mine. Her touch was warm, grounding the way her mother's had been in the years before everything grew complicated. "Dad," she said softly, "the kids didn't know who to trust. They were scared. They didn't know what Holden was doing. But they saved something because they thought you might need it one day." I nodded, swallowing the tightness in my throat. The refrigerator hummed again, louder this time, filling the space between us. Rowan's fingers tightened around the zipper. He looked directly at me, and in his eyes I saw both fear and a quiet determination that didn't belong to an 11-year-old. He took a breath that lifted his shoulders. "Grandpa," he said, "we're ready to show you." The room fell quiet. Even the heater stopped, leaving the house wrapped in stillness. The lights from the street glowed faintly through the blinds, painting thin stripes across the floor. I reached out slowly, my hand hovering near the backpack, not touching it yet. I felt the cold from the window at my back, the weight of the moment pressing forward. Something important was waiting inside that bag, something that would change the shape of everything I thought I understood. I let my hand settle gently on the table, and in that quiet I knew the next truth was about to step out of the dark. Rowan kept the backpack close to his chest, his fingers curled around the straps as if his small hands were guarding something fragile. The house was quiet except for the soft tick of the hallway clock and the faint sigh of the heater as it pushed warm air across the floor. I could hear my own breathing, slow and uneven, as he stepped closer. He knelt beside me and unzipped the backpack with careful movements. A small USB drive rested inside. He picked it up between his fingers and laid it in my open hand. His voice came out barely above a whisper, the kind children use when they know a truth is heavier than it looks. It synced to my tablet by accident. I was trying to log into their Wi-Fi. It just appeared. I closed my fingers around the drive. A simple piece of plastic and metal, but it felt heavier than steel. Uma slipped onto the chair next to me, folding her legs beneath her eyes, fixed on the laptop, as though she already knew what we were about to see. Tamsin shifted her chair so she could sit beside me. Her hand rested lightly on the table, close enough for comfort but not touching, as though she understood I needed a moment before leaning on anyone. The lights from the Christmas decorations across the street flickered through the blinds, painting little red and green stripes on the wall. I plugged the drive in. The screen lit up with a list of files. One was marked with a date from early November. I clicked it. The first clip opened to the living room of Holden's house. Bright ring lights glowed in the background. Maribel adjusted them with quick, practiced movements, her face tight with irritation. She glanced off screen and said, annoyed but sweetened for the camera, "Don't let Grandpa in the frame. He ruins the aesthetic." The words floated into the kitchen like cold air slipping under a door. I felt Rowan shift beside me. His knee bumped mine and he didn't pull away. The clip ended. I clicked the next. Holden sat at his desk. The room was dim, only a small lamp lighting his face. He leaned close to his keyboard, typing carefully, pausing to whisper explanations to himself. Password resets. Authorization changes. My accounts displayed on his screen as if they were part of his nightly routine. He wasn't anxious. He wasn't hesitating. He looked focused, prepared. I leaned forward slightly, my breath fogging the bottom corner of the screen. My hands tightened on the edge of the table. He had rehearsed answers aloud, as though planning for the moment I might ask a question and he needed to sound convincing. The third clip loaded. In the kitchen, Maribel stood with her arms crossed, looking impatient. Holden sat at the table, shoulders slumped, rubbing his forehead. She spoke with the clipped tone of someone discussing a business transaction rather than a man's life. File for guardianship by June. The market is hot. Sell his house while prices peak. You keep hesitating. We could miss the window. She paced behind him while he stared down at the table, silent. The urgency in her voice wasn't fear or concern or family. It was strategy, opportunity, calculation. When the clip ended, the kitchen fell silent again. I didn't move. I didn't breathe for a few seconds. I stared at the dark screen, seeing the reflections of the people sitting beside me. Rowan on one side, Uma on the other. Tamsin across from me, her jaw tight, her eyes soft. What broke inside me wasn't sadness. It wasn't even betrayal. It was something quieter, something deeper. A truth I'd been hungry for without knowing it. The truth that someone in this house still saw me, still believed me, still chose me. Rowan leaned gently into my arm. Uma placed her small hand on mine. The warmth of their touch blurred the screen in front of me. I pulled both children close, not tightly, just enough to feel their weight, their trust, their quiet bravery. My vision blurred and I let it. Tears slipped down my cheeks and landed on Rowan's hair. He didn't pull away. He just breathed steadily as though he had been waiting for me to finally exhale. Tamsin stood and walked around the table. She rested her hand on my shoulder, her thumb brushing lightly against the fabric of my shirt. She didn't say anything for a long moment. She let the silence settle, let the truth sit where it needed to sit. When she finally spoke, her voice was low and warm. Dad, you're not facing this alone anymore. I nodded, unable to lift my head. My throat felt tight, full of years of words I had never spoken. The weight that had pressed on my chest since Thanksgiving began to ease, not because the situation had changed, but because I was no longer standing in it alone. Outside, the snow had started again. Fine, steady flakes drifted across the window pane, catching the glow of porch lights along the street. They fell quietly, almost gently, as if trying to soften everything they touched. I kept my arms around the children. The laptop screen had gone dark again, but the truth was still there, pulsing beneath the quiet. The house felt different now, not lighter, but steadier, like a man bracing himself with both feet finally planted on the ground. Rowan lifted his head and looked at me. His eyes were clear and steady. We thought you should know, Grandpa. I breathed in slowly, letting the air settle deep in my chest. And for the first time in a long time, the truth didn't frighten me. It felt like the only gift I had needed, the only one that ever mattered. The heater clicked on again, warm air sweeping across the floor as the room filled with a silence that was no longer hollow but whole. The morning light came in thin lines through the blinds, landing across the kitchen table where the USB drive still lay beside the laptop. I sat there for a long time after Tamsin and the kids left, listening to the house settle into its familiar creaks. The heater cycled on and off, spreading warm air that never quite reached the cold that had settled in my chest. When I finally stood, the weight in my legs felt heavier than anything I had welded or carried at the shop. But I knew I had to move. I had to do something that belonged to me. The wind outside cut through the air as I stepped onto the porch. The driveway held a thin layer of frost that crackled under my boots. I brushed snow from the truck window, watching my breath lift into the cold morning. For a moment I thought of turning back, of waiting one more day, but something quiet and steady inside me kept my feet moving. It was not anger, not yet. It was resolve, the kind that comes to a man who has been pushed to the edge one touch too many. The drive into town was slow. Holiday banners hung from street lamps, swaying in the wind. Storefront windows glowed with warm lights, wreaths, cardboard Santas. All the things meant to say joy. My hands tightened around the steering wheel. I turned into the lot of the brick office building where Tamsin had scheduled my appointment. The parking lines were half covered by new snow, and the air smelled of chimney smoke drifting from nearby homes. Inside the hallway was warm and carpeted with a small table of peppermint candies and a plastic poinsettia. The name on the frosted glass door read Jolene Arkwell, Elder Law and Advocacy. I hesitated before knocking. I had never imagined I would need a lawyer for anything involving my own son. But here I was. She opened the door before I lifted my hand as if she had been expecting the pause. She was in her 50s, maybe early 60s, with gray hair pulled back neatly and a calm expression that didn't judge, didn't pry. Her office smelled of old books and pine cleaner, and a small ceramic Christmas tree glowed quietly in the corner. "You must be Earl," she said. "Come in, take your time." I stepped inside and sat in a chair that felt firmer than I expected. She closed the door behind us and took her seat across the desk. No rush, no dramatic gestures, just steady eyes and the kind of patience reserved for people who understand slow grief. "Tamsin sent me the recordings," Jolene said. "I watched them this morning." She folded her hands. "I want you to know what you are experiencing is something I see more and more." I nodded, not trusting my voice. She clicked a file open on her laptop. The screen showed Maribel adjusting ring lights, her voice faint through the speakers. Jolene watched without expression, but I could see the tiny shifts in her posture, the small nods that told me each moment matched a pattern she recognized too well. "These are red flags," she said quietly. "Consent violations, behavioral staging, financial manipulation." She clicked to the second clip, Holden at his desk whispering explanations to himself. I felt the breath leave my chest again, the same way it had the night before. "And this," she said, "this is unauthorized access to financial accounts. Documented and deliberate." She clicked to the last clip, the one where Maribel spoke in that businesslike tone about guardianship and selling my house. Jolene watched it without blinking. "This is coercive planning," she said, "and it is serious." When she closed the laptop, the room felt heavier but clearer. She pulled a folder from her drawer and laid it on the desk between us. "Earl," she said, "Holden filed for temporary guardianship last March. You were never served because he listed an incorrect address for you. That is a tactic I have seen used before." I stared at her, trying to steady my breath. It was denied in 72 hours due to lack of medical evidence, but it shows intent, and it shows he has already tried. The words sank in slowly like dye spreading through water. I didn't know what to say, so I let silence speak for me. She opened the folder. Inside were printed forms and a pen clipped neatly to the top. "This is a revocation of power of attorney. Once you sign it, he has no legal authority over your finances or decisions. None." I reached for the pen. My hand shook slightly, not from weakness but from something deeper. A kind of mourning. I signed my name slowly, each stroke steadier than the last. She nodded once, firm and approving. "I'll file this immediately," she said. "I will also prepare certified letters to all financial institutions and medical facilities. Every point of access will be revoked. There will be no ambiguity." She moved to the next paper. "Adult Protective Services will likely follow up given the recordings, and there may be tax implications if he claimed caregiver deductions under your name. We will address all of it, step by step." I breathed out through my nose, long and low. Something inside me loosened, not relief exactly, but an anchoring I had not felt in months. The weight had shifted from confusion to clarity. Jolene sat back slightly, watching me with a kind of gentle firmness. "This is a hard step, Earl, but it is the right one." I nodded slowly. The ceramic Christmas tree in the corner flickered softly, casting little colored reflections on the desk. I let my eyes rest on the lights for a moment, feeling something settle deep in my chest. She asked if I wished to proceed with the full legal process. I met her eyes, no hesitation this time. Yes, this is mine to do. She gave a small, almost imperceptible smile, the kind that respects a man's pride without diminishing his pain. When the meeting ended, she walked me to the door. The hallway smelled faintly of peppermint and snow melting off boots. I stood there for a moment, listening to the muffled sounds of offices and holiday traffic outside. Then I stepped into the cold, the air sharp against my face, and felt the first small pulse of strength return to my spine. Not victory, not yet. But dignity reclaimed in the quiet way an old man needs it most. The house was quiet when evening settled in, the kind of quiet that comes after a long day of holding yourself together. I sat in the living room with the small photo of Alara resting in my palm. The frame's metal edge had warmed in my hand, softening the cold it carried when I first picked it up. Her smile in that picture had a way of filling the room even now, a reminder of years when Christmas Eve meant pies cooling on the counter and the kids laughing loud enough to make the windows shake. Those nights felt solid, unbreakable. I sat there wondering when the foundation had gone shut without me noticing. The furnace rumbled on, pushing warm air toward my feet. Outside, a few houses down, someone's wreath bells jingled lightly in the wind. My phone lit up on the coffee table. A text. I leaned forward slowly, already knowing who it would be. The message sat there on the screen, too neat, too carefully worded. Come for dinner. No explanation. No warmth. Just a sudden invitation from a son who had been building a case against me in silence. I let the screen dim without touching it. The heater hummed. My breath eased out in a long, steady line. I left the phone face down and walked to the kitchen. The light above the sink flickered once before settling into a soft amber glow. I opened the fridge only to close it again, not hungry, not even sure what I was looking for. The quiet pressed in around me, but it wasn't suffocating. Not this time. It was honest, and I realized I preferred the honesty of an empty house over the performance waiting for me elsewhere. At 9:17, a sharp knock cracked through the cold outside. Then another. I froze for a moment, listening. The knocks carried urgency, not impatience. I walked to the door and opened it, and the winter air rushed past me. Rowan barreled forward first, throwing his arms around my waist with such force that I had to steady myself. Uma followed, climbing into the space between my arms, as though she had been holding her breath the whole drive over. The cold on their coats seeped into my shirt, but their presence warmed something I thought had been lost for good. Tamsin stood behind them, carrying a small Christmas tree in one hand and 2 grocery bags in the other. Her cheeks were red from the wind, her eyes tired but steady. She gave me a small nod, not a greeting, more like a confirmation that they were here for a reason we didn't need to name yet. "We're staying here tonight, Dad," she said quietly as she stepped inside. "The kids won't stay in that house, not after everything." Rowan and Uma kicked off their boots with quick, nervous movements, their eyes flicking to me every few seconds as though checking to make sure I was real, that this place was safe. Tamsin set the bags on the counter and began unpacking the food, still warm, wrapped in foil, smelling faintly of rosemary and roast chicken. The scents drifted through the room, filling the house with something I hadn't felt since before Holden grew distant. I stepped aside so she could carry the small tree into the living room. It wasn't decorated, just a simple pine with a few loose needles brushing her sleeve. She placed it on the coffee table beside Alara's photo. The two looked strangely right together, as if one had been waiting for the other. Rowan climbed onto the couch and reached for Tamsin's phone. She hesitated, then handed it to him. His hand was steady when he tapped the screen. He held the phone to his ear for a moment before speaking, his voice calm in a way no child should have to master so young. "We're with Grandpa, Dad. We know what you did." He didn't yell. He didn't accuse. He stated it the way you tell someone the weather has changed, simple and unavoidable. Then he ended the call and placed the phone face down on the cushion beside him. Tamsin looked at me, searching my face for any sign of what this moment meant. I couldn't speak right away. My throat felt thick, not with sorrow, but with something that pushed up from deeper within, something close to gratitude and ache all at once. I sank onto the couch beside Rowan. Uma slid next to me, tucking her hand into mine. The Christmas lights from across the street glowed faintly through the blinds, casting gentle colors over the room. The heater turned on again with a low, steady hum. Tamsin began unpacking plates, her movements quiet and deliberate. The house felt fuller, warmer, more alive than it had in years. I looked at Alara's photo on the table. Her smile softened under the glow of the small tree. And for the first time in a long while, the holiday didn't feel like something happening behind a closed door. It felt like something opening. I squeezed the kids' hands lightly. No words, just a breath shared between us. The kind of breath that says, we're here, we're together, we're not afraid of the truth anymore. The tree lights flickered softly and the house settled beneath their glow. Christmas hadn't arrived the way I remembered it, but somehow sitting there with my family's hands wrapped around mine, it no longer felt like a season I'd been left out of. It felt like a door, slowly, quietly swinging back open. Morning came slowly, slipping through the blinds in thin gray bands that stretched across the living room floor. The small Christmas tree Tamsin had brought the night before sat on the coffee table, its branches still carrying the faint scent of pine. Rowan and Uma were curled under blankets on the couch, the soft rise and fall of their breaths steady in the quiet. I stood in the doorway watching them, letting the warmth of their presence steady the parts of me that had shaken for too long. The house felt fuller than it had in years, yet I knew the day ahead would carry its own kind of cold. A knock sounded at the door just as the furnace kicked on, the two sounds overlapping in a way that startled me more than it should have. It was firm, official, the kind of knock that is not used by family or neighbors. I stepped through the hallway, the floor creaking beneath me, and opened the door to a woman in a dark coat, her breath forming small clouds in the winter air. She introduced herself with a simple nod. Nadine Bray, Adult Protective Services. Her tone carried authority but not distance. She stepped inside with the composure of someone accustomed to fragile situations. The kids stirred on the couch and Tamsin came out of the kitchen wiping her hands on a towel. Nadine greeted them with a brief smile, then turned her attention to me. I could tell she had already studied everything Tamsin sent the night before. There was a seriousness in her eyes that told me this was more than a courtesy visit. "Where would you like to talk?" she asked. Her voice was calm, respectful. I motioned toward the dining table. The room held the faint warmth of last night's meal, the smell of rosemary still hanging in the air. She placed a small folder on the table, its edges worn from years of use. For a moment she simply observed the room, absorbing the scene of children resting on the couch and the small tree glowing quietly nearby. "I have reviewed the materials your daughter provided," she said, opening the folder slowly. "The recordings, the account logs, the reports filed about you." I listened without interrupting. Her expression remained steady, but her eyes shifted with each page she turned. "This is not a simple misunderstanding, Mr. Reed. The reports submitted over the past several months follow identical phrasing and timing, and none were corroborated." She laid a document in front of me, lines highlighted in pale yellow. "These are the anonymous APS reports, all 5. I scanned the page. Words like forgetfulness and unsafe living conditions jumped out at me, followed by descriptions of incidents that never happened. Nadine tapped lightly on the margin. The writing patterns match, she said. Same structure, same vocabulary. That is a flag in our system. I sat back, letting the truth settle on the table between us. She moved to another sheet, one she handled carefully. We also found that your son claimed $14,000 in caregiver expenses on his latest tax filing. Given that you live independently and file separately, this will require IRS review. She paused, allowing space for the words to land. I stared at the document. The ink blurred for a moment, not from confusion, but from something deeper. A slow ache rising behind my ribs. Nadine continued gently. This kind of financial discrepancy often accompanies exploitation cases. It does not confirm intent, but it triggers mandatory inquiry. Tamsin stood near the kitchen doorway, her arms folded loosely across her chest, watching every movement without speaking. Rowan and Uma sat quietly now, sensing the weight in the air. Nadine opened another portion of the folder. Our next steps are straightforward. I will conduct a formal interview with you today to document your understanding of your finances and daily routines. We will also assess your capacity, though nothing I have seen so far raises concern about that. Afterward, additional interviews will be held with all parties involved. Her tone did not waver, but there was no coldness in it, only clarity. She folded her hands. There will also be a family meeting on December 28. It will be mandatory. All parties must attend and provide documentation. Failure to appear can result in further penalties. I nodded slowly. The room felt still, as if even the air was waiting. Nadine took a moment, then added, Mr. Reed, I want you to know that you are not under suspicion. You are the protected party in this case. Your cooperation will help us ensure accuracy and transparency. Those words, spoken so plainly, settled into me with a strange blend of relief and exposure. I felt seen in a way that was uncomfortable but necessary, like standing under a light after months in dim rooms. She asked a few questions next, not intrusive ones, but steady ones. Did I manage my own bills? Did I prepare my own meals? Did I have trouble remembering appointments? Each answer came quietly but firmly. Yes, yes, no. Her pen moved quickly, noting details in an organized, practiced rhythm. When she finished, she closed the folder and rested it on the table. That is all I need for today, she said. She stood, glanced once more toward the living room where the kids sat huddled together, then met my eyes. Her voice softened at the edges. This is the beginning of a process, Mr. Reed. Not the end, but you are not alone in it. I walked her to the door. She pulled her coat close before stepping out into the cold. When the door closed behind her, the house returned to quiet. The heater clicked on again with a low hum. I stood there for a moment, letting the warmth brush against my arms. I walked back toward the living room. Tamsin's eyes found mine, first steady and full of something that felt like resolve. The kids shifted closer, their small faces watching for any sign of what came next. I did not speak. I simply let the silence settle, the kind that carries truth rather than fear. The tree lights flickered softly, casting colors across the floor. And for the first time since this all began, I felt something solid beneath all the uncertainty. A sense that the truth was no longer something I carried alone. It had a witness now, someone with authority, someone who would not look away. The room grew quiet again, holding that new truth gently like a candle sheltered from the wind. The hallway outside the conference room smelled faintly of fresh paint and leftover holiday potpourri, the kind offices put out for appearance more than warmth. I stood there for a moment with my hand against the door frame, feeling the weight gather across my shoulders. It was December 28, cold enough that my breath still lingered in front of me long after I exhaled. Tamsin stood beside me holding a folder to her chest, her jaw tight but steady. Rowan and Uma waited with a neighbor down the hall, their small voices drifting like echoes I wasn't meant to hear. I kept my eyes on the carpet a moment longer before pushing the door open. The room inside was too bright. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, reflecting off the polished table that seemed too long for the 5 people sitting around it. Holden and Maribel were already there, their chairs angled slightly toward each other instead of facing the center. He looked thinner than I remembered, eyes darting from me to the laptop on the table, then back again. Maribel sat almost motionless, her hands clasped neatly in her lap, but the tightness at the corners of her mouth betrayed something harder than composure. Jolene sat at the far end with her laptop open and a stack of neatly arranged documents beside her. When we entered, she gave me a small nod without smiling, a gesture of recognition and reassurance all at once. Nadine stood near the monitor mounted on the wall, her file already open, her expression neutral but firm. "Please have a seat, Mr. Reed," she said. I lowered myself into the chair, feeling the cold air settle around my neck, despite the heat pumping faintly through the vents. The metal legs of the table echoed softly when I pulled my chair in. There was no small talk, no attempt at easing into anything. Jolene reached for her laptop cord and connected it to the monitor. A quiet click sounded as the screen woke. "We will start with the digital evidence," she said. The first video loaded. Holden stiffened before a single frame played. The image came up on the screen, grainy but unmistakable. Him sitting at my desk, my bank accounts open in front of him, whispering rehearsed explanations to himself. The kind of whispers a man practices before lying to someone he believes won't question him. The room felt tighter as the footage played, the faint hum of the monitor underscoring every move he made. Holden leaned forward abruptly. "That isn't what it looks like," he said, voice strained. "Dad asked for help. He forgets things all the time. He told me to." His words tangled and paused when the next clip started. Maribel adjusting her lights, repositioning props, then saying clearly that I ruined the aesthetic. She shifted in her chair now, her posture still rigid, but her eyes dropped toward the table. Holden reached for her hand, but she pulled it back so slightly it looked more like a reflex than a decision. The recordings shifted again, the clip where they discussed guardianship timelines. "Sell the house by June, file before he slips further." Their voices played in the stillness of the room, sounding louder than they had the night I watched them on my laptop. The chairs creaked as everyone shifted except for me. I stayed still, hands resting on my knees. Holden's composure began to crumble. "That was taken out of context," he said, clearing his throat. "We were worried. We thought Dad needed structure. He forgets appointments. He gets confused." I did not say anything. Nadine did. "Mr. Reed has passed every cognitive assessment administered this week," she said calmly. "There is no indication of impairment." Holden blinked hard as though trying to knock back panic. Jolene opened her folder with the slow efficiency of someone who had done this too many times. She placed 2 sheets of paper on the table. One held my real signature. The other showed a version of my name that looked like someone had tried to imitate confidence with shaky pressure. "These were filed with the guardianship petition," she said, sliding them toward him. "You listed the wrong address for service, a tactic sometimes used to avoid notifying the protected party. Even the clerk flagged it." He stared at the signatures, then at me, then at the table. A faint sheen of sweat rose along his hairline. Maribel remained still, jaw tightening even further as if holding her breath in case the wrong exhale exposed her too. Nadine stepped closer. "Mr. Reed is competent. The reports filed about him were false." The tax deductions claimed under his name will be forwarded for federal review, and the financial transfers from his account have been documented for criminal evaluation. The air shifted in the room as her words settled. A finality entered with them, something heavy and irreversible. Holden's face changed in an instant. His eyes reddened, filling so quickly it looked like they had been waiting to spill for weeks. His voice cracked on the first word. "Dad, please. Please tell them I didn't mean to hurt you. I was trying to help. I thought you needed someone to manage things. You don't understand the pressure we've been under." I didn't know what to do. Each sentence trembled more than the last, collapsing under the weight of months of planning disguised as concern. I watched him, the boy he once was, clashing with. The man he had become, and the mixture collapsing in front of me with a soundless breaking. I waited for something inside me to soften. It didn't. I leaned forward slightly, the edge of the table cool beneath my fingertips. My voice came out steady, quieter than his, but stronger for it. "You didn't steal my money," I said. He froze, breath hitching. "You stole the part of me that trusted you were still my son." The room held that sentence like a slow-moving echo. Holden bowed his head, shoulders shaking. Maribel looked away, her stare fixed on the blank far wall. Jolene closed her folder quietly. Nadine wrote the final notes in her file. The meeting ended not with shouting or accusations, but with a silence that felt sharper than any argument. Chairs scraped softly as everyone stood. Papers were gathered. Coats pulled on. No one made eye contact. I walked out last. The hallway felt cooler than the room had been. The lights softer, the air easier to breathe. Tamsin waited at the end of the corridor, her eyes meeting mine with a question she didn't need to speak. I gave a small nod. Not victory, not relief. Something else. Something heavier but cleaner. Outside, the winter air pressed against my coat as I stepped into the parking lot. Snow from the morning had settled into a thin, untouched layer across the pavement. I stood there for a moment, letting the cold wrap around me, steadying the tremor into my chest. The truth had been spoken aloud, and once spoken it could not be walked back. Not by him, not by me. The drive home after the meeting felt heavier than the cold December air pressing against the truck windows. The sky hung low, thick with the color of unfallen snow, and the streets were quiet in that hushed way the world takes on after Christmas. I pulled into the driveway slowly, noticing the faint glow from the little tree Tamsin and the kids had left lit inside. Through the window, its small lights blinked with a fragile steadiness, like it was trying to hold the house together on its own. Inside, the warmth hit me first, then the soft murmur of the kids in the living room. They were sitting cross-legged on the rug, sorting through a sole pile of ornaments they had brought from home. Some were old, faded in spots from years of being moved or dropped by small hands. Others were new enough that the paint still held its shine. Rowan stood up when he saw me, his face earnest in that way boys sometimes carry responsibility before they should. "We got you something, Grandpa," he said. Uma followed him with a small cardboard box wrapped in festive paper that didn't quite meet at the edges. Tape held the folds together with the determined effort children give to making something feel special. She placed it carefully in my hands, her eyes wide with the hope that I might see it the way they meant it. I sat on the couch, felt the roughness of the paper beneath my fingers, and tore it open slowly. Inside was a small external drive, plain silver, untouched by any label. I turned it over once, twice, letting the weight of it settle in my palm. Rowan spoke softly. "We saved everything. The videos, the screenshots, the stuff Dad said. It all went here, in case you ever needed it." Uma leaned into my arm, nodding sweetly. She didn't need to add anything. Her small hand on my sleeve said enough. The room felt still except for the distant hum of the heater. I closed my fingers around the drive and felt something stir inside me. Something that reached past anger and past sorrow. It wasn't the evidence itself that moved me. It was their instinct, their courage, their quiet understanding that love sometimes means paying attention to the things grown-ups pretend not to notice. I looked at them, really looked, and for the first time in a long while felt something open in my chest. Being seen can ache, but it can also heal. Tamsin came to sit beside me, placing a gentle hand on my shoulder. Her voice had that softness she saved for moments when truth needed space. "Dad," she said, "do you want to press charges?" I stared at the tree, its small lights flickering against the window glass. The question hung between us heavy, with two paths I wasn't sure I wanted to step onto. Justice on one side, mercy on the other, both sharp in their own ways. I shook my head slowly. "The law will handle what it needs to," I said. "I just want my life back." She nodded once, not pushing, accepting it with the calm of someone who finally understood the weight I had carried alone. We moved then quietly, gently, the way families do after a storm has passed. But the ground is still fragile. The kids brought the box of ornaments closer, spreading them out across the coffee table. Some were mismatched, some chipped, others from years I barely remembered. But together they looked like something whole. Rowan picked up a small wooden reindeer missing part of its antler and handed it to me. "This one goes high, Grandpa," he said, "because it's the oldest." I placed it carefully on a branch, the faint scent of pine rising as I reached upward. Uma hung a small silver bell near the bottom, stepping back to check if it looked right. Tamsin adjusted a string of lights around the back of the tree, humming under her breath without realizing it. The living room warmed with each ornament, each small moment of ordinary tenderness. It reminded me of years when Alara and I stood beside a much bigger tree, our hands brushing as we placed things in the best spots. The memory didn't hurt the way I expected it to. It folded gently into the present, a quiet companion rather than a wound. When we finished, we sat on the couch together. No one spoke for a while. The lights from the tree cast soft reflections on the window, and the room felt like it had grown fuller without anyone else entering. I looked down at the silver drive resting in my hand. A small object holding so much truth. A child's gift, but something more. A bridge back to myself. For the first time in years, Christmas didn't feel like something taken from me by circumstance or distance or disappointment. It felt given, steady, earned, and sitting there with the people who chose to be near me. I realized it was the real gift I hadn't known I was waiting for. The wind outside the community hall was sharp enough to sting my ears as I pushed through the glass doors, the kind that made everything feel stripped down to truth. Inside, the air smelled of old carpet and winter coats, and the lights overhead burned with a cold steadiness that made no effort to soften what was coming. People filled the room in pockets of tension, quiet clusters of family and officials and neighbors, who had all been pulled into a story none of us expected to share. I felt the weight of every step as I crossed the floor. My boots sounded too loud on the tile, each thud landing like a reminder that there was no turning back. Jolene waited near the far table, her folders arranged with the kind of precision that only comes from years of watching families unravel and rebuild in the same breath. Nadine stood beside her, posture straight, eyes alert, taking stock of every person who entered. Holden arrived last. His shoulders were tight, jaw working, eyes darting between the people gathered as if the room itself were stacked against him. Maribel stayed half a step behind him, wrapped in a coat too thin for December, yet refusing to shiver. They did not look at me. I did not look away. A clerk closed the door and the sound clicked through the room like a trigger. Papers shifted, chairs scraped. The tension rose slow and steady, a climb no one could stop. Nadine opened the meeting with a firm voice, explaining the purpose, the evidence, the need for clarity. Holden kept nodding too quickly, his mouth pressed into a line that tried to look cooperative. But the moment Jolene set the first document on the table, he straightened as if bracing for an impact he had hoped would never come. Before I could speak, Maribel stepped forward, her voice smooth but strained. She said there had been misunderstandings, small mistakes, assumptions made in good intentions. She talked quickly, words tumbling like rehearsed lines that had lost their rhythm. She said I was forgetful, that I confused dates, that Holden stepped in only because I needed help. Her voice tightened when she tried to smile at me, as if pleading for a version of the truth that would let her walk out untouched. The smile did not stay. Nadine listened without a single change in her expression. When Maribel finished, Jolene placed a second document on the table. A forged signature. My name in a shape I had never written. The air in the room shifted. Even the fluorescent lights seemed to hum differently. Holden's voice cracked when he tried to explain. He said he thought I wanted things easier. He said he assumed I trusted him. He said he never meant for anything to go this far. His hands trembled as he reached for the document, but he pulled them back before touching it. I felt something inside me bend tighter than fear and sharper than anger. My fingers curled on the edge of the table to keep from shaking. For a moment I could hear my pulse louder than Holden's words. A woman stepped forward, then someone I hadn't expected. Mrs. Keenan from 2 houses down, bundled in her heavy coat, a knit hat pulled low. I had not even seen her slip into the room. She said she had something to add. She spoke gently, but each word landed with weight. She had seen Holden's car parked outside my house at times that made no sense. She had watched lights flick on at hours I never kept. She had worried, she said, but did not know how to ask me without meddling. Her voice broke on that last word. The room went impossibly still. I could feel every gaze tilt toward me, waiting for something I had spent months avoiding. My throat tightened. My chest felt too small. I stood. It took longer than I meant it to. My knees felt unsteady, and for a brief second I feared they might give out. I saw Rowan's worried eyes from the back of the room. Uma clutching Tamsin's sleeve. Their small faces solemn with the kind of knowledge children should never have to carry. I turned toward Holden. My breath caught, released, caught again. Words waited behind my teeth, refusing to come out neatly. I told him I had trusted him because he was my son. I told him I had signed papers believing he wanted to help, not to build a case for a future where I no longer controlled my own life. My voice shook once, then steadied. I said I wanted honesty, not guardianship, respect, not signatures, presence, not access. Holden opened his mouth, but no sound came out. Something in his eyes flickered, a quick flash of guilt or fear or both. And he looked down as if the floor might forgive him more easily than I could. A rustle of movement filled the room as Nadine stepped forward with a folder. She said there was one more piece of information still under review, but she could not disclose it until the next hearing. She placed the unopened folder on the table. The weight of it seemed out of proportion to its size. The moment that folder touched the wood, the air tightened again. The climb toward the breaking point snapped back into motion. I stared at it, feeling the tension coil inside my chest. I could sense that whatever rested inside would change more than numbers or timelines. It would shift the entire foundation of what came next. No one moved. No one spoke. Jolene's eyes met mine, steady and sure, waiting for a signal I wasn't ready to give. The room held its breath with me, and just as I reached for the folder, the clock on the wall clicked to the next minute, the sound sharp as a gavel. I stopped. My hand hovered in the air. The truth inside that folder would not stay hidden forever. But it would not open here. Not yet. The room remained frozen in that held breath, waiting for something I wasn't ready to release. The breaking point hovered inches away, suspended between us all. The house felt different the first morning I took the ornament box down from the attic. The air was still cold, but it no longer carried the weight it used to. A year had passed since the hearings and the long evenings of sorting through paperwork with Jolene, yet the memory of those days flickered through the quiet like a small shadow that no longer frightened me. I set the box beside the modest pine tree in the living room and stood there for a moment, letting the room settle around me. Winter light came through the curtains in soft gold streaks, touching the floor as if it recognized the place again. The faint hum of the heater and the scent of pine mixed in a way that felt steady. On the counter lay an envelope from the county office, unopened since last week. It was part of the final verification process, something Jolene had told me was routine, nothing to worry about. I left it where it was, not out of avoidance, but because it no longer felt like a threat. Some things could wait without hurting me. I heard small footsteps on the porch, followed by the sound of gloved hands fumbling with the doorknob. Rowan pushed the door open and stepped inside with a burst of cold air trailing after him. Uma followed, carrying a small paper bag in both hands, her eyes bright. They came straight to the tree, moving with the ease of children who felt at home here. Their winter coats glistened with melting snow as they knelt near the box of ornaments. Tamsin arrived a moment later, brushing snowflakes from her hair and offering me a tired but warm smile. She hung her coat by the door and headed to the kitchen, where she began setting up mugs for coffee. From the hallway came the sound of neighbors greeting her, offering holiday treats the way people in Indiana do when they mean to stitch a man back into the fabric of a community he thought he had lost. I had spent years turning down invitations, but this year the hallway filled slowly with a gentle mixture of voices. I sat near the tree as Rowan reached into the box and pulled out a crooked star he had made in art class. He held it up against the lights, judging the right spot. Uma placed her bag on the rug and pulled out a small felt circle with uneven stitches, smoothing it with her thumb before hanging it on a low branch. Watching them brought a warmth I had missed for years, a feeling that life had slowed down enough for me to catch up. On the coffee table sat a stack of letters tied with twine. Holden had written them slowly over the months, each one a little steadier than the last. He spoke about work, about therapy, about the things he was trying to face in himself. They were not apologies, not exactly, but they were honest in a way I had not seen from him in a very long time. I had not written back. I was not ready, but I kept them all. Healing is not the same as forgetting, and distance is not the same as closing a door. The children called me closer, urging me to help them hang another ornament. As I reached into the box, my fingers brushed against something small and wooden. I lifted it out and realized it was an old ornament Holden had made when he was Rowan's age, a tiny wooden truck painted in uneven red streaks. The wheels were crooked. One axle had been glued back on with too much glue, the way little hands often do. I must have tucked it away years ago without thinking. I held it for a long moment. The room around me went quiet, the sounds of neighbors in the hall fading as if the house itself was giving me space. The weight of the ornament was almost nothing, yet it carried years inside it, pieces of a time when trust had been simple and love had not yet grown complicated. I walked to the tree and found a branch near the middle, steady and lit by a warm yellow bulb. I hung the wooden truck there, letting it sway gently as the tree settled. Behind me, I felt Tamsin watching. She did not say a word, but when I turned, she nodded once. A small, understanding gesture that said she saw what it meant to place the past where it belonged. Not erased, not shining too bright, just present. On a higher branch hung Alara's photograph, framed in silver. Her handwriting on the back still felt like a touch on the shoulder. A man's worth isn't in being needed, but in standing tall when no one does. The lights around the frame flickered softly, and I felt the ache that lived with those words settle into something gentler. I touched the edge of the frame not to hold on, but to honor the part of me she had steadied. Tamsin handed me a warm mug and stood beside me in the glow of the lights. The children stepped back to look at the tree, their faces bright in the shifting colors. The room felt full, not crowded, just full in a way that made the walls seem warmer. As evening came, I opened the front door to let in a breath of cold air. Snow drifted quietly across the yard, settling on the steps. The porch light shone in a soft circle, and for a moment I watched the flakes fall, each one landing as gently as the year had finally landed on me. A year ago, I had stood at this same door feeling small and shaken, unsure what pieces of my life I could still hold on to. Now the light behind me spread across the floor, steady and warm. I closed the door and the latch clicked lightly, no longer heavy. The sound felt like the final stitch in something that had taken a long time to mend. The children called me back to the tree. I walked toward their voices, feeling the room brighten with each step. The night outside was cold, but the house, for the first time in a long time, felt like a place I had earned my way back into.